there's a lot more to talk about today, funny enough, than last week when we spoke. I'm actually going to start with the story that's been catching the headlines right now, and that's talks about an assassination attempt or fears of an assassination attempt against President Trump in Ankara. So the report was the New York Times said he changed Air Force Ones because of a security threat. And it came from Israeli sources, so take it with a grain of salt. And then funny enough, Barak Ravid from Axios, a kilo of salt. And then Barak Ravid from Axios said that there was no credible threat or plans by Iran to conduct an assassination attempt against Trump, but there were just talks among leadership, which I think that would be the case. I'm sure different leaders would talk about that possibility. And then we got information in the last couple of days that Trump was actually sneaked off of Air Force One with 3 of his advisors, without Marco Rubio, without anyone else who remained on Air Force Ones, onto another aircraft, not an Air Force One. Because there was, according to a report today from the Wall Street Journal, the threat was some militants. So it's not a plan by Iran, but some militants had a plan or discussions about firing a missile, a shoulder-based missile onto Trump's Air Force One when he was taking off in Ankara. But according to the same report that came out today, some U.S. officials considered the alleged plot implausible since there was no evidence the suspected militants possessed the necessary missile system in Ankara, while Turkish officials later said that they found no evidence Trump had been in danger. But despite those doubts, the Secret Service did sneak him on a catering truck off of Air Force One onto another aircraft. Now, my position is I'm sure many people in Iran would like to see Trump killed after what happened to their country. Some of them may even advocate for the assassination of President Trump. But from what I've seen so far, I don't think Iran's leadership has any serious plans to kill the president, because it does not advance Iranian interests in any way. It's more vengeance rather than a pragmatic strategic step to achieve certain objectives. That's my position. But I would love to get your thoughts on whether you think there could be discussions like this about potentially targeting Trump, whether now or in the future.
Well, you said that Axios said that among the leadership in Iran, they were discussing it.
That was from a couple of weeks ago. That was right after the Ankara summit. But something along those lines, either leadership or officials. I think it was officials. So when I say officials, it could be just members of parliament, which there's like 200-300 of them, I think.
Yeah, because there's no doubt that the Israelis have no access to what the high-ranking people in Iran say. There's way too much security for that. And the Iranians are much too smart for the Israelis or the Americans when it comes to these issues. One of the things about the Iranians is that they put so much information out there that the Israelis and the Americans are often at a loss as to what is right and what is wrong. One of the things about Iranian intelligence that I know of a bit is that when the U.S. embassy was taken, because the United States supported the Shah, they helped the Shah impose a police regime, a police state for 2.5 decades. And then, of course, during the revolution, the Shah used his army to gun down people for many months, but ultimately fell. And the U.S. embassy, from the very beginning, was working to overthrow the state. They gave refuge to the Shah, the United States, and then the embassy was working with remnants of the previous regime, the military, to do a coup, with separatist groups to create armed insurrection, terror organizations, militant groups in Tehran and other cities to create unrest. The U.S. embassy was the center of conspiracy against the new Islamic Republic. And so that's why the students took the embassy, because they were afraid of a repeat of 1953, the U.S. British coup back then. But regardless of what happened after the embassy takeover, one of the things that happened was they took all the information, the secret information that the CIA had in the embassy, and they began to publish them and read them and publish them, and then those documents that were shredded, they put them all together, and it was like 50 or 60 books. And so a lot of these students, later on, they joined the intelligence. And some of them became the initial, let's say, group that ran Iranian intelligence. And they had already learned a lot about how the United States functions and how the U.S. intelligence agency, the CIA, how it functions. So what they would do is that they would send a lot of Iranians who, some of them worked for the Shah's regime. Some of them were people who were about to retire from the army, and a lot of them, like, just not religious people who could convince the CIA that they were with them. So they would send these people to U.S. embassies abroad to offer themselves to cooperate with the CIA. And apparently a lot of these double agents, a lot of these people became double agents for the 1980s and the 1990s. And they misled the CIA a great deal during those 2 decades. I don't know about afterwards, but I knew a thing or two about what was going on back then, later on, but I don't know what they do now.
You knew a thing or two. Were you one of them, Professor?
Me? I was, when I was 16, I volunteered to fight in the war. And I've never, I've only lived abroad. I've only lived abroad from 1999 to 2003, 3.5 years doing my PhD in Birmingham. So nothing much goes on in Birmingham, but in the UK. I mean, I'm not to disrespect the city, the people of Birmingham, but it's not. I don't think it's the center of intelligence gathering.
It's not Brussels, that's for sure.
Yeah, and so in any case, so in the 1980s, the early 1980s, I was either at school or at university, or I was in the war fronts as a volunteer. And I survived 2 chemical attacks. So whenever I hear Americans or Europeans talk about human rights, I break out. What they say, I break out in a rash. It's like, yeah, really, the Americans and the Europeans and human rights. Nowadays people appreciate it more because of Gaza, because of the war on Iran, because of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Venezuela, Cuba. But back then, yeah, it was, surviving chemical weapons was a horrifying thing. And of course, the irony is that the Germans did more than anyone else to provide Saddam Hussein with those chemical weapons. And of course, ironically, they overthrew Saddam Hussein in the name of those very same chemical weapons that they gave to him to use against people like me. Anyway, that's a different story. So the U.S. intelligence on Iran has never been very good. And the same is with Mossad. I think Mossad and the United States create this aura of invincibility and that they know it all, and the Iranians like to play with that a lot. And the Iranians, they played with them quite effectively. And as we see with the military, I mean, if the Israeli regime and the Americans had so much intelligence on Iran, they wouldn't have carried out these 2 catastrophic wars. They would have known what exists in Iran's underground missile cities, what exists in Iran's underground drone cities. They have no clue about what the capabilities of the country really are. So,
just on that one, I wanted to say, like, my counterpoint to you was, I think you're dismissing their capabilities. And look what they did. The Hamas leader, for example, when he was in Iran, they knew which hotel room they planted a device. Also, all the leadership in Iran, which we're going to talk about, the leadership who replaced him recently, who was appointed by Mujtaba Khamenei. But the leadership that was targeted and assassinated, other than the supreme leader who was in his home, other leaders were targeted throughout the war. But your counterpoint it wasn't meant as a counterpoint, but the point you made about not knowing how the war will turn out, but also Iran's missile capabilities and the ability to fire missiles, fire drones. Trump saying he was surprised that they fired at the Gulf, kind of makes your point that maybe either the intelligence was good and the US was misled, But then the US should, like Trump was misled by the intelligence community intentionally, or the intelligence community genuinely had false intelligence and expected the war to go differently.
Well, there's talk of deceit and deception and deceiving the American people nowadays. But I don't think targeting Iranian leaders was a great intelligence coup. Ayatollah Khamenei was in his office, and there's nothing extraordinary about that. And the other leaders, I mean, the United States is the only regime in the contemporary world that assassinates leaders and targets, so the Americans and the Israelis, what they do is that they bomb apartment blocks, kill everyone inside so that they can get one person. I guess the Iranians underestimated the barbarism of the U.S. military and of course, the similarities that exist between the United States and the Israeli regime. What the Israelis do in Lebanon and Gaza, the United States does too. Perhaps that was that they underestimated. But except for the first couple of days, in this war, as we move forward, they didn't. The assassination attempts became less and less effective, and ultimately, the Iranians defeated them. They defeated the combined force of the United States, the Israeli regime, and those proxies in the Persian Gulf that facilitated this war. And by the way, these regimes in the Persian Gulf that were part of the war, not only did they provide space, but I'm sure you know that those bases, they pay for the U.S. presence in these bases. It's not as if all costs are paid for by the Americans. No, they subsidize. They do more than subsidize. They pay for a lot of what goes on in these bases. So they shoulder a lot of the financial burden of the wars against Iran, and they helped us, both the Americans and the Israeli regime, because the refueling planes that would fly, they would both American refueling planes. They would refuel both American planes, but also Israeli planes in the war. So these countries were effectively in coalition with the Israelis and Americans in assaulting Iran. And I've always said that Iran should demand reparations from each and every one of these countries. But anyway, so
there were reports from Iran today that the Emiratis have been delivering billions of dollars and gold to Iran. There was a report today. I saved it. Came out just not long ago, but that's from Iranian sources. The UAE has released several $1 billion of Iran's frozen assets held in Emirati banks, including 2 tons of gold worth $283 million, with the goal being that Iran spares the United Arab Emirates from future attacks, according to multiple senior sources in Tehran with knowledge of the transfers. The assets were flown to Iran aboard a Boeing 737, blah, 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 operated by who, blah, blah, blah. And
Who
they went
said
up.
this?
Oh, you didn't see that? That came from Iranian sources.
No, which news agency said that?
And not one of the major. I want to say this. It's not a major news outlet. These are and not a major Iranian news outlets or Western news outlets. But there's been multiple Olsen accounts pointing at a lot of Emirati jets flying to Iran for an hour or two and then flying back. And even today, they fly for 1 hour and then they return. They fly for 1 hour and then they return. And there's been rumors about the UAE delivering a lot of money to Iran for a while. And for me, I'm not surprised. I've been saying this could happen for a while because the Emiratis, they've done business with Iran for a long time, and they need stability. Their whole model depends on stability. We've discussed this a while ago. So I'm not saying this is true. This is all unconfirmed, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Even if this were true, which I can't confirm, but these are not reparations. According to this report, these are stolen Iranian assets. So returning stolen assets is not a favor. It's like me stealing your car and then returning it to you, and you thank me for the car.
It's a bit different. These are sanctions imposed by the US and the Western world. That the Emirates should abide by those sanctions. So for the Emirates to unfreeze assets, there must be a deal done with the US as well to allow them to do that. There must be a lot of things happening behind the scenes. You make a valid point. This is not extra money paid, but I definitely see it as a significant gesture if there's billions that has been unfrozen. That's a lot of money.
Well, we'll have to see. Time will definitely tell. But going back to the initial point that you made, yes, it's clear that overwhelmingly Iranians would like to see Trump killed, and and executed or put on trial or whatever. And I think the same is true with all those who pulled the trigger and killed, whether in Mina, where they killed all those little children, elementary school kids, mostly girls, or in La Mer, where they bombed on the first day of the war too. They bombed a sports complex, killing a lot of little young women, teenagers who were playing volleyball. And apparently that was an experimental missile, which did pretty good in wiping out those, young teenager girls. But so yeah, I think the Iranians would like us to see a lot of Americans and Israelis executed, pilots and anyone else who was involved. But I don't think the government would be involved in this sort of thing. And I personally think that probably the Israelis made a fool out of Trump. And Trump, of course, what he did was cowardly. No one, all those, I mean, let's assume that the threat was real. Whatever, a group, a militant group, or whoever. All those journalists were allowed to be sacrificial lambs for Trump. I find that pretty disgusting.
I had one of my guests yesterday, an American guest, got really upset at me because I was bringing up that topic, and I said, I don't advocate. I think if Iran decides to assassinate Trump, I think that doesn't work to the advantage of Iran, because Iran is seen as the victim of a war of aggression. And, as you seek revenge or as you do things like this, it moves the needle away from being a victim more towards being an aggressor. I'm not saying it suddenly moved from being a victim to an aggressor, but if Iran kills Trump, more of an aggressor, bombs a school, more of an aggressor, declares war on the US, more of an aggressor. And the Iran knows this, and that's why I don't think they'd be trying to kill Trump. So I was making that argument, and I also pointed that I don't advocate for the assassination of Trump, and they got really upset. I said, Mario, that's the way of thinking is not right at all. What the US has the right to kill the supreme leader of Iran, and Iran doesn't have the right to kill the president. And then my counterpoint to that was,
I'm sure the slave owners. I'm sure American slave owners in the 19th century had the same mentality.
So the point that I made, though, is I said, two wrongs doesn't make a right. So I don't think Iran should kill the president of the United States, whether now or later. The same way Iran, just because their leader was killed, the same way I don't think Iran should bomb a school in the US just because their school is bombed. I think Iran should seek justice. That is their right, and I hope they get justice. I don't think they will. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. But that was my position. I think from our discussions, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're in a similar position as I. You don't think Iran should try to assassinate the president of the United States. Is that fair to say?
One thing I would just clarify first, and that's that if A assassinates B, the leader of B, and B retaliates and assassinates the leader of A, that's retaliation. That's not illegitimate. That doesn't make both sides an aggressor. The side that started it is the aggressor. But in any case, I don't think that Iran is going to put any money or anything like that into such an operation. I think the Iranians have said that Trump deserves this. All those people who murdered Iranians and the children, and the same is true in Gaza and elsewhere, that they are killers and they deserve to be punished and they should be on trial like in Nuremberg. But I don't think that, I don't see any evidence that the Iranians have put any funding or any effort into carrying out any form of operation whatsoever. I just believe that's nonsense. And I think that the Israelis, if they pass on that, and I would imagine that the Israeli regime did that they passed on that sort of information to humiliate Trump or to make him fear being assassinated or whatever the agenda is. But again, either the Israelis, their intelligence is awful, which, as I said, they're not nearly as good as they claim to be, as the war has shown. And again,
unless they fed Trump false intelligence, which I'm in that camp.
Yeah, or they fed him false intelligence in this case, or elsewhere. But bombing, let's say, where I live is known. So if the Americans and the Israelis bomb my house, it's not an intelligence coup. Everyone in the neighborhood, from the supermarket guy to the the barber shop, they all know where my home is. So and the same is true with others. Assassinating Iranians by firing missiles at their apartment buildings is not an intelligence coup. That's just how the United States and the Israeli regime work. They are utterly barbaric, and this is where sometimes, because when you say, like, this is terrible what's happening to the United States, and the Chinese are. I saw something, you were doing a show with someone about the economy, and I listened in, and you were saying this is terrible that the United States is falling back. I don't see the United States as morally superior to any country on this planet. In fact, I consider them the most morally inferior, the U.S. government on this planet, after the Israeli regime. I prefer Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, well, the former Venezuela,
North Korea,
any country to these
That's
two
North
countries.
Korea.
Oh yes, definitely. North Korea has never used chemical weapons against other nations.
It doesn't mean,
North
but
Korea,
doesn't mean they wouldn't if they have the
North-
capacity.
Yeah, well, I don't know. They haven't done it yet. But North Korea doesn't, rape prisoners to death in prison, and then the rapists are celebrities on TV, and they go on TV
That's
shows.
Israel.
And,
Yeah, that's
well, the United States supports it, so the values are the same. If God forbid, well, I don't even want to give the example, but if A
you can give
carries out all sorts of atrocities, and then B, meaning me, aids them in carrying out those atrocities, there's not much difference. Without B, A could never do those things.
I'll tell you my stance. Yeah, I'll tell you my stance. That's a very interesting point, because I've thought about this. I'll tell you my stance is because I could criticize U.S. foreign policy, what the U.S. has done in Iran, what the U.S. has done in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the Middle East, on and on. The support for Israel is probably the thing that upsets me the most. While also, wanting the U.S. or a democracy, I'd say U.S., Europe, etc., to be a superpower or one of the superpowers. The reason is I believe in, I don't want to say Western values, that's very broad, but I believe in democratic values. I believe in decentralized power. Now, I know the U.S. is not a perfect democracy, but the argument
it's not a democracy.
No democracy. But I just want to explain the argument of, like, okay, but then does that mean I advocate for what the U.S. is doing? My worry is, if we move to a world where China being the superpower, the hegemon, or a unipolar world, and that world is more peaceful, then I would advocate for that. I would advocate, because I'm against war. But my worry is, when a country has the amount of power that the US has, if you look throughout history, whenever there's a hegemon, whenever a country has unchecked power, it tends to abuse it. And I think this is not an American problem. This is not a British problem. This is not a Japanese problem when it had the Japanese Empire. This is an Ottoman problem.